In an increasingly interconnected, yet deeply fractured world, the paradox of human progress stands in stark relief against persistent patterns of suffering. Across regions marked by conflict, rising geopolitical tensions, and prolonged instability, the most profound costs are often borne not by those who wage wars, but by those least equipped to endure them: children, women, and ordinary civilians. The loss of young lives, the disruption of families, and the silent expansion of humanitarian crisis reveal a troubling continuity that vulnerability, rather than agency, often determines who suffers the most. Beyond the visible devastation of conflict lies a quieter, yet equally unsettling dimension of human conduct. Acts of violence and injustice, whether in the form of gender based crimes, social discrimination, or everyday indignities, are frequently accompanied by narratives that seeks to rationalize them. Victims are questioned, their choices scrutinized, and their dignity reframed through the lens of blame, while perpetrators find refuge in socially constructed justifications. Such patterns are not confined to extreme situations. They extend into ordinary interactions, where individuals in subtle ways diminish others to preserve their own sense of moral comfort and superiority. This raises a fundamental question about the nature of morality itself. If harm can be so readily justified through language, through context, through selective interpretation, then the issue is not merely one of isolated wrongdoing, but of a broader cognitive and social process through which individuals and societies distance themselves from ethical responsibility. Wars, conflict, and everyday acts of insensitivity may differ in scale, but they often share a common thread: the human capacity to disengage from the moral weight of one's action. In reflecting of these realities, one is compelled to ask not only why such injustices persist, but how they continue to be normalized, explained away, or rendered invisible. It is within the space between action and justification, harm and its interpretation, that deeper insights into human behavior, morality, and responsibility begin to emerge. Consider a simple yet deeply unsettling moment. A young woman walking down a street. She is followed, commented upon, perhaps even touched without consent. And somewhere in the mind of the perpetrator, a quiet justification emerges. She should not have dressed like that. Probably she's wearing a very short skirt. She should not have been out so late, etc. etc. In that moment, something profound happens. Not just an act of wrongdoing, but a psychological transformation. The act is no longer seen as wrong. It is reframed, softened, justified. This is what Albert Bandura called moral disengagement. At the heart of Bandura's social cognitive theory lies a powerful idea. Human behavior is not driven by single force, but what he called dyadic reciprocal causation, a continuous interaction between personal factors, behavior, and environment. We are not merely products of our surroundings, nor are we purely rational agents. We are self-regulating beings, capable of guiding our own actions, but also justifying them. This is where moral agency enters. Bandura describes two dimensions: inhibitive morality that restrains us from harming others, and the proactive morality that motivates us to do good. Ordinarily, our actions are governed by self-sanctions, feelings like guilt, shame, or remorse. These are internal checks, but moral disengagement works at a subtle and dangerous level. It selectively deactivates these self-sanctions. We do not lose morality, we just switch it off. And that happens strategically. Bandura identifies 8 mechanisms through which this disengagement unfolds. At the behavioral level, we reconstruct the act itself. For example, moral justification, euphemistic labeling, and advantageous comparison. Emphasizing on euphemistic labeling, in which harmful acts are renamed in softer terms. At the agency level, we dissolve responsibility. For example, displacement of responsibility. I was just following orders. diffusion of responsibility. Everyone was involved. And at the outcome level, we minimize harm. For example, distortion of consequences. I didn't really hurt anyone. Coming to the victim level, we alter perception of others. Dehumanization. The victim is stripped of dignity. And attribution of blame. They brought it upon themselves. Nowhere it is more visible than in language. Take euphemistic labeling. Words like collateral damage instead of killing. Sexual assault in place of more brutal realities. These are not just linguistic choices, they are more strategies. Here, Bandura converges with Irving Goffman's idea of framing, the notion that reality is never simply presented, but always structured through interpretation. Media, institutions, and discourses do not merely describe events, they frame them, selecting what to highlight and what to soften and what to omit. And in doing so, they shape what we perceive as acceptable, tolerable, and even justified. This insight resonates deeply with Michael Foucault, who argued that power operates through discourses, through the very ways in which truth is constructed and circulated. What we call reality is often a product of framed narratives, and within those narratives, moral boundaries shift. Bandura's most unsettling claim, however, lies elsewhere. He rejects the comforting belief that evil people commit evil acts. Instead, he aligns more closely with Hannah Arendt's idea of the banality of evil, that ordinary individuals, under certain conditions, can perform extraordinary harm. This is echoed in Stanley Milgram's experiment on obedience, which individuals inflicted sufferings simply because authority instructed them to do so. It finds linguistic expression in George Orwell's critique of political language, how words can make violence appear respectable. And it is institutionalized, Noam Chomsky shows, through systems that manufacture consent by shaping narratives at scale. Even in moral psychology, thinkers like Jonathan Haidt suggest that we do not reason our way to moral decisions. We often justify them after the fact. And while Kohlberg emphasized moral reasoning, Bandura reminds us that knowing what is right does not ensure doing what is right. What emerges then is a layered understanding. Individuals disengage morally, but the very reality within which they act is already structured to enable that disengagement. Here, Bandura meets Kaufman. We do not simply justify our actions, we inhabit framed worlds where justification feels natural. And yet, this stands in tension with very different visions of morality. Immanuel Kant imagined a world governed by duty, where actions are guided not by convenience or context, but by universal moral law. A world where human beings are always treated as ends in themselves, never merely as means. But look around. In moments of conflict, in structures of power, in everyday interaction, that ideal feels distant, and in its place, we often see something else. Lives reduced to numbers, sufferings reframed as necessity, voices silenced by narratives, and among the ruins of these abstractions are the most vulnerable. Children whose worlds end before they begin. Women whose dignity is negotiated, questioned, and denied. Not because they choose conflict, not because they invited harm, but because somewhere in someone's mind a justification was made, and a moral boundary was quietly crossed. Perhaps the most disturbing truth is not that harm exists, but that it can be explained, normalized, and even accepted. And so the question remains, in a world where morality can be disengaged, reframed, and reconstructed, what does it truly mean to remain human? And as the noise of the world settles, as headlines fade and arguments dissolve into silence, what remains is something far more intimate, a quiet conversation with oneself, not about wars, not about systems, but about the small, almost invisible moments. The time you judged someone without knowing their story. The time you justified a harsh word because you were hurt. The time you stayed silent when you could have spoken. The time you laughed at someone's suffering to preserve your own comfort. How many times have we said, it wasn't that serious. That's probably because they deserved it. Everyone does it. And in doing so, how many times have we gently, almost imperceptibly, stepped away from our own moral core? Because moral disengagement is rarely loud. It does not always arrive as cruelty. Sometimes it arrives as convenience, as indifference, as the need to feel right, even when we are not. And if entire society can normalize suffering through language, through framing, through power, is it not possible that we too, in our own small ways, participate in that normalization? So perhaps the question is no longer just about what is there out in the world, but about the world within. When did we begin to explain away what we once knew was wrong? When did empathy become negotiable? And when did silence become easier than truth? And almost importantly, in the quiet spaces where no one is actually watching, when justification is within reach and conscience is not distant. In that very moment, who do we choose to be?